Going to go ahead and announce the three that we'll have here for our theology session, and then we'll get going. First up, we're going to have Phil TALLON, who is an associate professor of theology at Houston Christian University and the dean of Houston Christian University School of Christian Thought. And then after that, we'll have Wes Vanderlungst, who is an adjunct professor at Gordon Theological Seminary and acting director of the Leighton Ford Institute of Theology and the Arts. And then finally, after that, we'll have Kevin. There's Kevin Magnus. And Kevin teaches liturgical, let's see if I get this right, liturgical theology and sacramental theology or something like that in Chicago. And you can fill in the details on that. So, all right. So let's welcome up Phil, and we'll take it from there.
Okay, don't panic and hit the button a million times. So. All right, I've got this. Hey, good morning. Thanks for having me here, to all the organizers, and for inviting some reflection on an area that's a little different from what I normally talk about. Most of my work is on evil, and so it's a pleasure to talk about sanctification. Very familiar with evil, but sanctification I want to become more familiar with. So just some basic framing. I'm Wesleyan by background, and so Wesley will talk about sort of stages of sanctification. One way you can talk about it is the removal of sin. So in new birth, the power of sin being broken in you, but then at entire sanctification, the being of sin having been removed. But I think that though we often speak and think of sanctification as just sort of the gospel of sinning less, ultimately it's directed toward the telos of loving God and loving our neighbor in order to be fully human in relation to both. And so we want to kind of keep that in mind, and I think that's relevant for our ability to interact well with works of art. And that's what I'm going to focus on. So I've so enjoyed getting to hear about the intersection with architecture and neuroscience and so forth, but most of my work is on very narrative forms of art, and so that's where I'm going to focus in, thinking about evaluation. A lot of my current work is on horror, actually, and so some of this can have to do with the sort of moral evaluation of art, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So, basic question we might just sort of ask is just like, hey, as we become more holy, as we develop Christian virtue, habituated excellence, does our taste improve? And it, on the very surface level, in terms of my experience of everyday life, it seems like the answer is contrary to what my theological priors would say. So my theological priors would say, yes, if we assume that there's a unity of truth, beauty, and goodness, broadly construed, and these are rooted in God, then we would assume that sanctification and good taste are convergent. The more we grow in understanding of truth and love of goodness, things attendant with sanctification, we would grow in understanding and love of beauty. So I would expect that Christians, or those who are pursuing sanctification more broadly, would have better taste. But in my everyday life, I don't find a lot of evidence to support this assumption very often. Many of my moral exemplars, wonderful, holy people that I look up to, I would not take their advice in anything related to aesthetics, right? And many of the most illuminating critics that I interact with, I wouldn't want to have a life that looked like theirs, right? So it seems like that there's not convergence, and also sometimes reading bad religious criticism, it seems like there's even divergence. Like the more invested we become in religious matters, the worse we are at doing good art criticism. And so what do we do with this situation? And so here's where I've found that the work of Berys Gaut, I think am I saying his name right? Berys Gaut? Berys Gaut, who's at the University of St. Andrews, to be particularly helpful. I find his work helpful in my own work interacting with with horror in articulating an account of how we can of a convergent account of how, as it were, sort of sanctification, or the development of moral sensibilities and attunement can intersect with the excellent evaluation of works of art. And so on Gaut's account, there's he gives a mild form of a moralistic account of the ethical evaluation of art. He calls it ethicism, and he says that ethicism is a less strong kind of moralism. It holds that an artwork is aesthetically flawed insofar as it possesses an ethical flaw that is aesthetically relevant, and conversely, that an artwork has an aesthetic merit insofar as it possesses an ethical merit that is aesthetically relevant. So on strong accounts of moralism, just the ethical flaws like trump any aesthetic matters. Okay, that novel is sadistic, therefore that novel is a bad novel. But ethicism has a milder position where ethical flaws can count against a work's overall aesthetic merit, and ethical excellences can count for a work's aesthetic merit. And I find this to be really useful actually in interacting with horror, where I sort of say, okay, there's something that's clearly valuable in this work, but I still think that there are problems that sort of, as it were, make it lesser than it might be. So a couple of key assumptions that I think are necessary if you're not just overly familiar with Gaut's work. First is that his focus is on intrinsic over extrinsic effects, and so some people have worked on the ethical effects of interacting with works. Actually, there's some interesting Templeton work on this, or studying sort of what interacting with a certain work of art then has to sort of how it makes us more helpful or altruistic or some such thing as that. He's not interested in assessing such things. He's interested in looking at the point of view, as it were, within a particular work, sort of what the artist aims to elicit in the person who's viewing a particular work. So what are the intrinsic goals? Second element of ethicism that I think is relevant to talk about here is what you might call values integration. So insofar as those responses that were prescribed to his audience are aesthetically relevant, the aesthetic successes of a work depend on whether those responses are merited, and the merited responses include ethical ones. So if an audience grasps the work correctly and is sensitive to the full range of its aesthetic properties, it will be guided in its responses in part by moral considerations. So there are moral aspects to the effects of a work on an audience. So part of the point here is, I think, a pretty basic common sense one, which is there's just an aboutness to a lot of narrative work, which is that it's about life, and life includes these moral considerations. And so if you're taking on a subject that includes those things, then in order to effectively evaluate how the work treats that matter, ethics is involved in evaluating the work itself. We can't just disentangle the moral from the aesthetic for the purpose of evaluation. So I'll give a quick example, and then Gaut's sort of thought experiment, his really good example, I think, of how this plays out. So one would be the insensitive, inappropriate, immoral joke, which is nonetheless well told. Might be an example of this. So somebody at a party might sort of tell you a joke that you have reservations about, but it's well told. Charming kind of timbre of voice. It has that incongruity that delivers that surprising but fitting response. And so you have a regretted chuckle. But the presence of your moral revulsion, maybe at yourself, maybe at the person who's telling it, diminishes, is not just an ethical matter, it diminishes the intended emotional effect of comic amusement, right? So the joke is less funny because of the presence of its immoral element. So it's a worse joke, not just sort of a joke that has an immoral dimension. And so if a joke has a jaded attitude towards some serious matter, it's not only a moral failing, it's a comedic one. Second example, so here's where Gaut's book, Art, Emotion, and Ethics, has a really fine series of contrasts. So he, from two paintings in the Louvre, he takes on Bathsheba, right? So the famous summoning of Bathsheba by David. And the first painting he considers is by an artist named Drost, and who is a pupil of Rembrandt and paints in the same year as Rembrandt takes on the subject as well. And Gaut sort of analyzes the painting. Okay, well, it's clearly done with a great amount of artistic excellence, right? It's the brushwork is fabulous. The use of light is compelling, but Gaut thinks that there's a message, a point, an intended attitude of the painter. Here, Bathsheba is being portrayed as a largely sexual object for our gaze. So if you got those glasses from yesterday and put it on museum goers, we would sort of see what the focus of the painting is intended to be, right? And so he points out this is Bathsheba seen through David's eyes. Contrast that with Rembrandt's work painted in the same year. Here is Bathsheba seen through her own eyes, Gaut says. A much more nuanced, complex, and sophisticated understanding of the scene. Here we have Bathsheba situated in her domestic context with with one of her servants. She has the letter, as in the Dross painting. It's still a nude, and there's a much deeper sense of perhaps sorrow or contemplation of all the things that lie in front of Bathsheba as a result of responding to David's inappropriate exploitative summons, right? So this is a Bathsheba that invites us to contemplate the sort of the fullness of the situation, its tragedy, the degree to which Bathsheba's humanity is harmed by this summons. And so, according then to Gaut, Dross and Rembrandt give us two distinct ways to think and see Bathsheba. And the ways they do this are intimately bound up with and are fully understandable only by reflecting on the ways in which they have painted their subject. Rembrandt then has taught us to see Bathsheba and her like in a way that is closely bound up with a painterly mode of expression, that also allows us to view the human world anew and more accurately. And it is in large part because Rembrandt's vision of the subject is deeper, richer, and truer than Dross that Rembrandt has produced the greater painting. There's more to say here, but I move on to my conclusion. So returning to this convergence-divergence question from the beginning, taking Gaut's points up, is there one last slide here? Oh, here we go. One's walking through the Louvre and you come across these two paintings. It seems to me that you have two different people. So person A, who regards paintings in the Louvre as a pretext for gazing upon well-painted nudes, may well enjoy Dross painting more. It's idealized luminosity, right? But person B, who's attuned to the tragic dimensions of Bathsheba's story, her humanity, her embeddedness in relationship, the tragedy of adultery, the abuse of power by David, may well enjoy the Rembrandt more because of its sensitive handling of the multifaceted nature of the scene. Further, person B, who understands the fuller biblical story, may then also find Dross painting somewhat superficial, even reductive. It treats the very subject it has chosen with less seriousness and thought than the subject deserves, especially by comparison. And because these two works are necessarily embedded within narratives that have a moral dimension, moral evaluation is essential to our evaluation of them. And so, virtue, including moral probity and discernment, is not irrelevant to artistic appreciation. Rather, love of God and love of neighbor, which is the heart of sanctification, can assist us with proper appreciation of artistic works. And so this seems like one instance where we can see convergence of sanctification and proper appreciation. Thank you all very much.
All right. Well, some of you will be relieved that I'm not really talking about beauty in this session, although I do think beauty is extremely relevant to the topic of XTA. And what I'm presenting here is essentially an addendum to Mark's wonderful paper last night, his first point on the centrality of sensory experience in our encounter with God. So the main point here is that at the heart of Christianity is an embodied sensory encounter with divine revelation. Most approaches to theological aesthetics are largely conceptual in nature, focusing on what David Bentley Hart calls the aesthetics of Christian truth, as revealed through the beauty of a triune God. But what I think these approaches often skip over or ignore is how divine beauty comes to us through embodied sensory aesthetic experience. The word of life is not merely what we have understood or spiritually apprehended, but as John articulates, that which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. We can apprehend the word of life only because the word of life was and continues to be manifested to us in sensory ways by the agency of the Spirit. So aesthetic experience bears theological weight when we recognize how God reveals and encounters us through embodied aesthetic experience, whether that's through created forms or subcreated forms such as the arts. But to affirm this requires that we get out over some of our age-old hang-ups regarding sensory aesthetic experience and embrace a holistic and a theologically robust account of embodiment, of materiality, of the senses. And doing so allows us to approach theological aesthetics not merely as an intellectual exercise, but as embodied aesthetic experience seeking theological understanding. But for many reasons that we really don't have time to rehash now, there has been a strong emphasis within the Christian theological tradition on the danger or on the irrelevance of physical senses, whether that's informed by ancient dualisms or modern presumptions of disinterested judgment. Sensory experience often falls under suspicion as the aspect of our humanity that's most liable to lead us astray from objectivity or from life in the Spirit. So consider, for Example, Augustine's lament over how sensory experience continues to have this tenacious hold on him after conversion. In Book 10 of the Confessions, he laments how various aesthetic experiences continue to overpower his reason, whether the smell of perfume, the sound of singing, the visual beauty of various arts and crafts. He writes this in the Confessions: "But my physical delight, which has to be checked from enervating the mind, often deceives me when the perception of the senses is unaccompanied by reason, and is not patiently content to be in a subordinate place. It tries to be first and to be in a leading role, though it deserves to be allowed only as secondary to reason." And he goes on to name this dominance of the physical senses as a persistent sin in his life. He says, I should be able to do away with all these things entirely. So placing reason above physical sensation, I think, relates to the tradition, beginning most notably with Origen, of distinguishing the 5 physical senses from the 5 spiritual senses. So here's Origen on First Principles. There are 2 kinds of senses in us. The one kind, mortal, corruptible, human. The other kind, immortal, spiritual, and divine. And because the physical senses are corrupted or corruptible by sin, we can only truly experience God if our physical senses are infused by the grace of spiritual sense. Without the spiritual senses, we're just living in the flesh. So again, in another work, Contra Celsum, we need a sense of sight to contemplate supernatural things, such as the cherubim and seraphim, a sense of hearing which perceives voices that do not resound in the exterior air, a sense of taste that can savor the bread that came down from heaven for the life of the world, a sense of smell that perceives what Paul thus describes: we are the fragrance of Christ for God, and a sense of touch whereby John says he has touched the word of life with his hands. And all that may be true. However, what the tradition often fails to emphasize, and what I think hinders a full development of theological aesthetics, both ancient and modern contexts, is a failure to recognize how God gifts and enlivens new spiritual senses in and through the physical senses. There are some exceptions. Balthasar, thank you, Mark, for your good work on von Balthasar, who's tried to avoid the dualism between, in his words, hopelessly worldly approaches of empiricism and hopelessly otherworldly or unworldly approaches of mysticism as it relates to the senses. So for Balthasar, the physical form is a necessary medium for the encounter with the glory of the Lord. But more careful work needs to be done, I think, to show how spiritual senses grow out of and are dependent upon, in a sense, physical senses and our existence as embodied aesthetic creatures. And I believe that a framework is really needed that could provide invaluable support for experimental theological aesthetics, which values theological interpretation of sensory aesthetic experience and empirical data. So just in the few minutes I have remaining, I want to suggest several of those frames that should be a part of a bigger theological framework to take seriously both the physical and the spiritual senses. So first and most importantly, the Christological frame. Mark addressed this a little bit yesterday, but there is no more radical theological statement than the declaration that God became flesh. This is at the heart of our faith. We don't know God not because God has been revealed through ideas and concepts, but because God has been revealed through the body of Jesus. A revelation which was physically heard, seen, smelled, touched. So God's incarnation in Jesus of Nazareth was based on God's eternal decision to be with creation forever in embodied and physical ways. The resurrection of Jesus and our own is therefore not an escape from embodiment and physical senses, but their glorification. So the Christological frame allows us to see embodied aesthetic experience not as a distraction from spiritual realities, but as a way to encounter the God whose love generates incarnation. Second, creational frame affirms that the physical world is an overflow of God's beauty. I can't get away from that concept, sorry. And that beauty and the goodness of the created world persist despite the disruption of shalom and the reality of sin. So God's creation and the products of human creativity are not spheres to be avoided in favor of spiritual contemplation, but rather places where God's beauty goes belonging, places where God is delightfully present. The creational frame leads us to affirm embodied aesthetic experience as a witness to God's ongoing creation and our human participation in that work as sub-creators, to use Tolkien's word. The anthropological frame then leads us to embrace the fullness of our image-bearing humanity, to embrace embodiment, physical senses, the making and receiving of aesthetic experience. Yes, our embodied experience is necessarily limited. Yes, sin impacts our ability to encounter God through the physical senses, as Origen, Augustine, and others are at pains to emphasize. And yet our embodied aesthetic life is God's plan A for how we should relate to the divine. And not only that, but as an increasing number of theologians and philosophers are pointing out, all knowledge and aesthetic experience is by definition embodied. So we need to embrace that. All right, just a couple more here, if I can get this to work. The pneumatological frame foregrounds the Spirit as God's breath of creative life and love. The Spirit is not in opposition to embodied life, but breathes into and animates embodied life and makes possible transformative encounters with God through created and subcreated forms. So the pneumatological frame is not limited to how aesthetic creativity may or may not be Spirit-inspired, but broadens out this perspective to view all creation as God-breathed artistry, including our embodied aesthetic life. And the fact that human beings are conscious makers is already a gift of the Spirit. So is the ability to live and create in sync with the breath of God. And finally, the eschatological frame focuses on how our future with God is not disembodied or purely spiritual, but an existence in which embodied aesthetic life has been preserved and has been purified. So embodied and aesthetic rich worship, for example, will continue in the eschaton and the new heavens and new earth, and so will joyful acts of aesthetic making and receiving. The New Jerusalem will be an aesthetic wonder, and the glory and honor of all the nations will be brought into it, including the glory of their art and culture. There are many other frames we could put up here, just showing how this kind of frame is necessary and give a sense for how this can support and advance the goals of experimental theological aesthetics and embodied aesthetic experience. So just in sum, I think experimental theological aesthetic explores the senses, how we see the splendor of God physically and spiritually, how we hear the voice of God, tasting the goodness of God, touching the body of God, smelling the aroma of God, and moving to the rhythm of God, to include a sixth sense in there. Not only through our spiritual senses, right? But through our physical senses and embodied aesthetic experience. We've talked a lot about architecture, and I've loved it over our time together, but I thought it might be fitting just to end with a poem that speaks to the unity of our spiritual and physical senses. This is Spring Song by Lucille Clifton. The green of Jesus is breaking the ground, and the sweet smell of delicious Jesus is opening the house. And the dance of Jesus' music has hold of the air, and the world is turning in the body of Jesus, and the future is possible. Thank you.
All right, Kevin, come on up.
All right, so my background per se is not in theological aesthetics, and that's, as you see, we have a blank screen here. So, all right, so I'm going to talk just from the perspective of a Catholic liturgical theologian, and so if you have the desire to throw food, just wait until the end. That if you get inspired. Okay. So the field of liturgical studies, I think, can benefit from the questions raised by empirical theological aesthetics, as well as contribute theoretical models and solidifying frameworks that might be further explored and tested. While much attention in the field has been given to the theological and historical development of texts, spaces, and gestures, there's generally far less reflection on how liturgies are experienced, and in particular, what faculties, tastes, and sensitivities might either inhibit or help foster a full conscious and active participation in the liturgical act. Investigation into the attitudes or dispositions that foster liturgical act ties into broader discussions in the field concerning questions of liturgical formation. Pope Francis, in his recent apostolic exhortation, Desiderio Desideravi, speaks of formation for the liturgy and formation by the liturgy, which exist in a mutually enriching relationship. The first sense suggests the need to be properly formed in the habits or dispositions to encounter the Paschal mystery and the liturgy, while the second highlights the actual experience of the liturgy itself as possessing a formative influence on the human person. We might say that the first pole of this model, of formation 4, has been recently enriched by the work of liturgical theologian David Fagerberg. For Fagerberg, Christianity is preeminently a way of seeing, a transformation of vision that sees all things by the light of the Holy Spirit. In his vision, the liturgy is an icon or an epiphany of life in the world as it should be lived in light of the kingdom of God. But he recognizes that if one is to perceive the world in this way, that the senses themselves need to be reformed through asceticism or embodied disciplines, such as prayer, fasting, almsgiving, as well as mysticism, right, the cultivation of the interior life. Through the practices of Christian discipleship and the taming of the passions, the cataracts of sin are wiped away, and we're given clear, newly restored eyes required to see the world in a full sacramental light. As Christ reminds us, blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. So asceticism here, from the Greek skesis or training, he means in the sense of a forming, right? Something that capacitates our receptivity, both to participate in the liturgy and to see the world as God sees it, thereby discerning traces of the Creator in his creation. Here, Fagerberg retrieves the wisdom of the Desert Fathers, particularly Evagrius of Pontus, who saw the first stage of wisdom, practicae, as a discipline training, as a doorway to spiritual sight and contemplative wisdom. This stage, however, leads to physicae, or a seeing of the entire cosmos in a new light by moving beyond appearances and sensing the hand of the Maker in all he's made. Finally, leading to theologia, or direct communion with God in pure prayer. Here, Fagerberg reminds us that the Christian imagination needs to be a disciplined imagination, or as he aptly names it, an ascetic aesthetic. So if you say that 5 times fast. And that to be capacitated to see requires the cultivation of a form of life and the acquisition of capacities that become deep-seated in controlling dispositions. In the words of his own teacher, Paul Homer, what we know depends on the kind of person we've made of ourselves. Here, Pope Francis himself claims that we must be the kind of person who's developed the fundamental attitudes and dispositions of awe, wonder, and astonishment at God's saving plan to really enter into the essence of worship. But in addition to what a formation 4 might require, reflection on formation from the liturgy invites further meditation on the transformative dynamic of Christian ritual practices themselves. Ritual theorists, particularly in the work of cultural anthropologist Victor Turner, have suggested that ritual performance functions in the subjunctive mood, creating a world as if. For Turner, religious ritual is representative of a cosmic order and allows its participants to integrate their experience of the human condition into this order. This approach suggests that ritual is not merely a didactic communication of information from a society to an individual, but fundamentally rooted in a particular vision of the world and of human thriving. This world of the liturgy is one of sacrificial love, communion between heaven and earth, God and humanity, and neighbor to neighbor. And it ritually rehearses these attitudes in those who celebrate it. Most importantly, this liturgical knowledge is communicated in and through the body. Philosopher Charles Taylor speaks of the cultivation of a social imaginary to refer to the way ordinary people imagine their social surroundings before they ever think about it, the way we perceive others in our collective life instantly. For Taylor, the social imaginary is not expressed in theoretical terms, but is carried in images, stories, and legends. Such an imagination is a form of habitus, or a learned bodily orientation to the world. Other philosophers and liturgical theologians will articulate this as a kind of attunement, whereby we are instruments who have been tuned to the world in certain ways. So rather than merely a cognitive, propositional set of beliefs, the imaginary resides in practices which give us a certain feel for the world, a precognitive disposition that's carried and absorbed on a bodily register. The rituals and practices of Christian liturgy are tactile and visceral, capturing the imagination through the sense of sight and sound, touch, taste, and even smell. They inscribe particular ongoing habits and desires into our character and bestow dispositions with a kind of automaticity about them, becoming second nature tendencies and inclinations that we often follow without thinking. Here too, research in cognitive psychology and neuroscience have supported the importance of non-conscious or automatic operations, highlighting the tactile way that the adaptive unconscious learns over time. In fact, drawing on these insights, Reformed liturgical theologian James Smith has argued that liturgy becomes an incarnate pedagogy of desire for God, and that this unconscious or non-cognitive love or desire is in fact always aimed at some vision of the good life or some particular articulation of the kingdom. And it is precisely what primes us to be so oriented and act accordingly is this set of habits or dispositions that are formed in us through effective bodily means, especially bodily practices, routines, or rituals that grab hold of our hearts through our imagination, which is closely linked to our bodily senses. In this way, ritual is not an end in itself, but implants a habitus that can govern human action across multiple dimensions of one's form of life, shaping a liturgical being in the world that sees God's presence in all of created reality here and now. Unfortunately, much within Roman Catholic 20th century liturgical reform and renewal privileged a didactic textual focus, which valued comprehensibility achieved through the reform of liturgical books. In this sense, often celebrations of the liturgy became excessively verbose. Catechesis, too, has often privileged propositional understanding and remains fixated on explanation. Here is implicit understanding of ritual whereby we first choose to believe and then take up a practice. However, ritual theorists have stressed that ritual works through the practices themselves that create the world as if. And it is through such practices that we can come to see ourselves as part of the narrative of salvation history, because it has in fact been written upon our very selves through the body. Liturgical formation then cannot be simply reduced to telling people things about a thing, a sort of verbal education of informing someone about meaning, but is also fostered through occasions of embodied wonderment. In this vision, art possesses a sacramental quality of immersing the viewer or listener into a narrative outside of the self, restoring the capacity to perceive the world as if in literature, music, and sacred space in a form of aesthetic knowing. Pope Francis's key distinctions of being formed for and formed by thereby present a helpful interpretive framework to solidify the foundations of experimental aesthetics. Highlights the importance of the necessary habits of perception required to approach the liturgy as well as artistic experience, recognizing that we never approach worship as a blank slate, but as someone who has received a formation, or rather deformation, through some sort of initiation to what James Smith calls the cultural liturgies of postmodernity. Rather, one must be formed in a contemplative gaze that beholds the wonder in creation, a gaze which is quite distinct from the sterile reductionism of pragmatic or technocratic forms of knowing. We might even say the idolatrous gaze of a digital culture concerned with capturing spectacle and presenting it to others. Yet it also highlights the important role that the liturgical act and other forms of historic Christian ritual practice have in reorienting these habits of perception, priming our precognitive dispositions, and shaping the Christian imagination. While liturgical theology has long emphasized that the ritual act is formative and transformative, empirical theological aesthetics can help enflesh the sense that the liturgy consists of signs and symbols that shape human desire, perception, and cognition in concrete ways. Because the liturgical act generates an aesthetic participatory mode of knowing through the senses, it thereby leaves an empirical trace, a residue, even if at the same time it transcends and remains irreducible to the empirically verifiable. Wittgenstein once remarked in passing that the world of the happy man is a different one from that of the unhappy man. So too, we might contend that the liturgical sight of those who've been transformed by the liturgical act causes the Christian to see the everyday world differently, or we might even say that it gives the Christian a different world to see. Empirical aesthetics provides opportunities to see whether and how, in fact, this might be the case. But ultimately, by emphasizing an understanding of theology as a form of vision and underscoring the formative role of ritual practice in the embodied act of sensation that primes us to see God, the world, and others in a particular way, the field of liturgical studies offers fruitful avenues for future study in the field of experimental theological aesthetics.
All right, now we're going to have two replies. First up is Sarah Alfaro. And yeah, come on up.
Thank you. All right. Good morning, everybody. Fantastic presentations. It's a lot for me. I come with an interior design background, PhD in environment and behavior. So it's just wonderful for me to take in these different perspectives and to learn in different ways. So I'm going to kind of maybe bounce back and propose something in a reflective attitude. So the first presentation, and going through my gobs of notes, Philip, I just think that it was thoughtfully confronted the tension between classical theology and this idea of truth, beauty, and goodness are united in God and lived reality in the moral virtue of aesthetic sensitivity. They coincide in a unique way. When I think about this in architectural design terms or space and structure, beauty is not confined to proportion, material refinement, or formal innovation. It also includes how the building shapes human relationships, honors dignity, maybe fosters community, and responds to responsible creation. And so if a space subtly promotes exclusion, vanity, or domination, these moral distortions may be understood aesthetically or incoherent. And so the idea that a building expresses hospitality, humility, maybe care or vulnerability can possess a depth that beauty exceeds stylistic appeal. So just kind of transforming this into the architectural world. A question that I may throw out for that presentation, instead of thinking about, is this building striking, or this idea of awe, what kind of people does this space help us become? That's a question I kept thinking over and over and over. How can this space help us become better humans in this world? And then Wes, incredible presentation. You raised an important challenge to theological aesthetics by naming the tension between embodied subject matter and this conceptual methodology. Sort of this embodied XTA in the space architectural frame. It prepares the human through threshold, procession, orientation, where this altar is not the focal point, but these rhythms and compression and release of spatial sequencing can shape how the body responds through stillness. And so the senses are not distracted, but directed. And so this is sort of what I was thinking as I was hearing your presentation, and kind of throwing out a question here. How might the sacred design intentionally shape sensory experience through material choice, spatial sequencing, and atmosphere, so the building itself becomes a site of divine self-disclosure rather than a neutral container for worship? So there we go with that. And then Kevin, great presentation. Thank you. Again, in some ways, I feel like this is way above my sort of domain, but I responding in sort of an architectural manner. Ritual and architecture merge powerfully. And so ritual gestures like standing or kneeling sort of create this sort of exchanging supportive thought in spatial design where we're engaged in the space. And so my question for you is, how might your content challenge contemporary worship practices to prioritize this immediacy or emotional impact over the sustained liturgical formation? Okay, thank you very much. There's only two of us. Okay.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Next will be Derek DeGroot. Come on up.
All right, thank you, my theologian friends. I keep coming back to this question in summary. Who designs the conditions where people encounter God? Considering, as Phil said, the fullness of the situation, I think as an architect, it's a really important question. I think we have to consider that hundreds of people, if not 1,000 people, may influence and the entire marketplace, commerce around a building. Thus, this idea of a collective virtue, I also keep coming back to. I also think that there is this tension we all live in here collectively, which is that the church, especially the evangelical church that I kind of represent here today, has spent 50 years or so developing an agnosticism toward aesthetic values, almost maybe from an anti-elitist point of view, or maybe best case from like an accessibility point of view. And I'd ask you to consider that some of this dysfunction actually serves the church. And so how do we consider that in there? And yet, I keep coming back to what I hear, that every built space and ritual encodes a theology, whether it's intended or not. And so just a couple thoughts and then a couple questions, I think, in summary here. I believe we need theologians in the room when making these decisions to capture this collective virtue. But I also think we need you to translate without thinning it out. So how do we simplify without simplifying, so to speak? And I beg you to consider that time is such a big condition of decision making. This ultimately is business in some collective form. And by the time the dialogue is had, the concrete's poured. So what do we do with that? And I think I've shared this before, but where the evangelical church is, the pastor is a leader and a communicator. The theological formation is being squeezed out of them, but they care. They want it. I see that. And Christian architects want it. I think we want more of this. So I think the big question I have is, how do we build a bridge? I'd love to hear your thoughts on what is the high leverage kind of entry point for building that bridge, and what's your role and our role as architects in building that bridge?
All right, thank you. If we can have the three panelists coming up, and maybe you guys can sit here. And why don't we have, first, let's have you guys each maybe respond to the questions, and then we'll have a little time for group discussion. So.
Here's two.
Actually, you want to go first? You want me to go first? Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. So many thoughts on those great questions. I think to address a little bit about what you were saying, Derek, at the end, because I've been a pastor for several decades as well, and have wrestled through these things in that context. My translation or my bridge building usually sort of happens on two levels. One is to help a community understand that every church has a liturgy, right? No space and no community is aesthetically neutral. So it's not, should we have a liturgy? It's what kind of liturgy are we immersed in, and is that forming us the way that we desire? Question is not, should we have an aesthetic space? It's what kind of space do we have, and how is that forming us? So that's one, is just to defuse that assumption of neutrality, or what word did you put it? Agnosticism. Let's not be agnostics, because then we're just going to be deformed rather than formed. And then casting a vision for like the way to our heart is through our bodies. And so that's always been the case in all human life, but it's particularly true, and I really appreciated your presentation, Kevin. It's particularly true in liturgical context, that we are being formed into the image of Christ by the Spirit through the engagement of our bodies and our senses. And so I would often cast a vision to my church as well, in terms of how, like, the moment you enter the parking lot, or the moment you walk onto this property, you are entering a story with your body. And it's a story that ideally would work you all the way through the story of God: creation, deformation, transformation in Christ, hope of reformation. And it's doing that in all the 6 sensory ways. And I include movement or spatial recognition as that 6th sense, which is, I think, particularly relevant to architecture. So some initial thoughts there.
Thank you for your responses. And Sarah brought up, that something about there's such a strong desire, I think, that we all have toward works that have this real charge to them and that are artistically innovative and bold. I think bold was one of the words you used, and that resonates with me a lot. I think that in the course of exploring works that were meaningful and important to me, very often they just kind of they jumped off the screen or off the page, and because of their artistic power and in very helpful ways, but sometimes not in lasting ways, right? So fascinated by what you all do in the world of architecture. It's not my world, but in 1995, I borrowed a friend's copy of Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, and I watched it, and it like just rocked my world. And I was, like elevated off the couch with just the power of this work. I recently, my daughter's a senior in college. She's interested in the arts. Hey, let's watch this movie. I haven't watched it in a while. I rewatched it, and I was struck all these years later, rewatching it, at how much the film had diminished, for me, because I could still recognize those elements that were so compelling, right? So innovative and just this incredible raw power to the thing. But there was so much less that fed my humanity, right? And so, so now I would rank kind of a boringish film from 1995, Whit Stillman's Barcelona, or 1984, Whit Stillman's Barcelona, as being much more nourishing to my humanity, to that kind of movie that helps to attune me to things that matter much more deeply. And so I think that tension is just part of what it means to engage with, with art, is that certain things just energize me. And I think I feel the same way looking at these architectural works. I mean, walking around the walls, definitely the ones that excite me the most are the ones that you just go, whoa, I've never seen anything like this. And I would so love to just get to encounter that space. But that's not the same as encountering a space that will shape you long term and help me to grow and develop and be more human in God's world. As far as the how to have conversations between artists and theologians, I think probably Wes is better at speaking about that. Maybe the only thing that I think I've learned is that in the evangelical world, which I inhabit, it's very common to talk about how so much concern around artistic expression has been concerned with what you might call boundaries, right? What are the sort of the acceptable boundaries for artistic works, and what ought we to engage with, what ought we not engage with? And not that I think that those discussions are inappropriate, but more and more I have found it's just necessary to, in a shared way, focus on what are the best things that we can all sort of focus on together. And so having, as it were, non-reactive, to some degree, almost agendaless focus on things that are great goods that we can, contemplate together, sort of work on, sort of what do we really want to head toward, strikes me as being one of the best ways to gather around some core conversations that are necessary probably before one can hash out really specific questions of what ought we do in this particular situation, or some such thing as that. And so, so if we're working together, I suppose, it is helpful not to look at edge cases or very particular tactical decisions, but to begin by looking at, okay, what is the good one is pursuing in crafting a worship space? What are the fundamental and central theological questions that inform these this decision? And so having a sort of a centered set approach strikes me as being really useful for having meaningful shared dialogue, which then does result in some ways in potentially being a little bit obvious, right? Like, let's just talk about big obvious things that we can so we can share together.
I guess you haven't.
I have one. Like detach. And then we get this one is fine. Like, yeah, either one. Either one. Okay. Yeah. So
thanks, Sarah, for your question in particular about when you distinguish between the distinctions between a sort of immediate emotional impact and then the sort of need for a repeated, sustained sort of initiation that ritual requires. And I think that highlights the fact that, again, this isn't just something that occurs just through changing certain things, either in the worship space or just even textual things, as I mentioned in my talk, but it relies on the formation that we have in the sort of cultural aspect of participating in the liturgy. And if we have a capacity to, detach and to slow down, to see the wonder in creation, that shapes how we then approach, right, entering into ritual. And so just something even basic from my own experience, and the seminarians that I teach, they have to go through a propedeutic year where they live together and they can't have a cell phone. And it's interesting just to hear their experiences in that, not living in that sort of technology of the self, you might say, that's happens through the immediacy of the smartphone, right? Where everything's immediately at your grasp. What they realize is they start to slow down and they start to build authentic community and relationships with one another. And they also start to say things like, wow, I noticed, the beauty in God's creation today. So I think part of it is that, is these habits or the dispositions that, how are we detaching in a certain way from certain things in our culture. But then also from a ritual theory, or from a ritual studies perspective, they would say that what ritual does is it presents a vision of a world as if, but then you go back into the world and you see it, the world as is, which is a broken, fragmented world. And so it needs the sort of repairs of ritual, right? You go back to it because you realize the distinctions between the sort of idealized world presented in the ritual structure and then your everyday world. And so we live in this tension between something that's already and not yet. And so to come back and encounter that is the work of ritual, which reveals itself over time. So things and capacities that build a sort of slow learning or slowing down, I think that's all things that help mitigate against the sort of culture of immediate gratification, all contribute to ritual deepening. And then the comment that I had in terms of Derek's question, from a Catholic context, I think there's the same sort of challenges, I think, in terms of a lot of times decisions are made in terms of pragmatism, right, and a sort of functionalism, but that I try to teach my students, right, architecture is a built form of theology. And so that means that you have to have a sense of what is, for example, the liturgy, what do we believe that's going on here, and then how that comes to an exterior visibility. But so it's I just challenge them to think deeper, to think more theologically, and not just to sort of give into the challenges of a functionalism. Yeah.
Can I say just one more quick thing, because I didn't address your great observation about how spaces and I think aesthetic experiences in general shape our relationships. One of the principles that I've always thought about in terms of what do I want to provide for a community in terms of aesthetic experiences is how do you create familiarity and surprise. And I think that goes with relationships as well. And like why I love the antiphonal seating kind of idea is people are expecting, well, I'm going to come into a church and I'm going to find a comfortable place to sit. So, and yeah, there's your places to sit, right? And that's familiar, kind of feel, you've got the pews there, but the surprise or the discovery is, oh, I wasn't expecting to see that person across the room, right? So how do we design spaces where we can find our friends, we can find our families, but spaces that are open to encounter strangers, to encounter neighbors we weren't expecting to see, that kind of thing. And I think that's also true principally about other aspects of life too, like and connects to a theological principle of God. God accommodates and relates to us, but God is never in our control. God can never be mastered, and God is the God of surprises. And so there's that element of discovery and uncontrollability in environments and in aesthetic experiences feels really important theologically.
Just got a couple minutes for like open discussion. So if you have a question, I'm happy to pass the mic to you guys.
I just wanted to make a couple of comments really on themes that came up. Two, the first is about the relationship between the physical and the spiritual. And it strikes me that it's important to observe that there is a sense in which the physical is importantly left behind. It's not abandoned, but it is left behind. And just take the case of the Word of God. So we take the Bible as the Word of God. Of course, it's got to be written down. So there has to be a physical manifestation of the letters on the page or perhaps spoken. But importantly, with the Christian Bible anyway, it can be translated into indefinitely many languages. But the Word of God doesn't change as the physical substrate changes. So, and in fact, of course, when you read it, and if we're accomplished readers, we're just passing over it. We're not even decoding anymore. We're just seeing the words and going straight to the meaning. And so in that sense, whilst it's true what you say about embodiment, it's important to observe that spiritual things, at least in this sense, can discount or discard any specific form of embodiment. And the same thing could be true of a piece of music, say. It could be on the piano, it could be on the organ, it could be the violin, it could be a combination of voices. The material substrate, the physical substrate, can be left behind and still we're grasping the same thing. So I just want to say, and this is not unconnected completely with the notion of sanctification, which is a moving upwards, upwards, upwards. And part of the sanctification on this model is to leave the physical embodiment behind, at least any specific physical embodiment. But the other comment I wanted to make was, it seems to me there has been a conflation. This was true in Mark's talk last night, between glory and beauty. And I'm not sure that that's the right thing, because I'll just put it this way. Beauty is something with which ultimately we are comfortable. Glory is something ultimately with which we should not be comfortable. And it's interesting to me that the ordinary everyday uses of language constantly empty these out. Take the word terrific. It's lost the terrifying element. Or awesome has lost the awe element. So here's one just thought when you're building churches. Let's make them beautiful, and beauty's nice, and so on and so forth. And I'm not thinking of the surprise where you see somebody across the pews that you weren't expecting. How could it be? And I think this is accomplished in some of the very great ecclesiastical buildings. How could it be that when people step into it, the initial response is one of silence and not admiration, not enjoyment, not the things that go with beauty, but actually something else? And, be still and know that I am God might be an interesting. How could architecture do that for us?
Anyone want to reflect on that?
I see what you're saying about the physical form shifts and there's the translatability, speaks to a spiritual core. I'm very uncomfortable. Sounds like a sort of a Tim LaHaye, like left behind. We're leaving the physical behind, and that's not what you're saying. But I do think rather than speaking of leaving the physical behind, perhaps the physical becomes, that contextualization, that translatability speaks to how there's always a multiplicity of physical ways in which we can experience the physical, but that actually enhances and never leaves us in a sense, the importance of the physical. And perhaps rather than thinking about beauty as that which pleases or that which delights, I really like the word astonishment, because it speaks to surprise. It speaks to maybe there's a side of terror that's served up there at times, a sort of fear and trembling, and so when God's glory overflows into the world and we encounter that as beauty, I think it can be as unsettling as it is pleasing.
All right, see Miles in the back, and then we okay with time? This way? Last two. Okay.
When I think about theology and architecture, one example always comes to mind, and that's the synagogue in Philadelphia designed by a non-Jew, by Frank Lloyd Wright. And in his encounter with this project, he discovered that there was something that was not typically taken advantage of in synagogue architecture. So the Road of Shalom is a radical departure from typical synagogue architecture. So theologically, he felt that in this triangular plan, one of the corners should be where the ark is. But the most important thing was that the center of the triangle would be a kind of locus, and that all the seats step down very subtly, wherever the rows are, down toward that center. So wherever you are in the space, you're leaning into community. I thought that was a wonderful example of how architecture can pick up on big ideas in religion.
Yeah, this goes to the glory and beauty conversation. And I remind, of course, of Burke's Sublime, this or the Numinous by Otto, right? In which we are really dealing with the radical other. God is a radical other that is beyond incomprehensibility, although it has been revealed through Christ. As we approach maybe God itself in this maybe more Catholic sense of the Trinity, there is this sense of being ultimately overwhelmed and losing yourself into that, and this sense of, at times, again, terrifying. So I think there is something about beauty that, like I always talk about the Grand Canyon. You approach the Grand Canyon, it's beautiful, but then as you approach the rim, there is this terror that happens that so I think there is something about the uncomfortability and this unself that you brought, that you begin to lose yourself. And in other faiths, in other practices, like in Zen, that's partially the process of enlightenment, like losing yourself completely. So I think there is an aspect of the terrifying quality that is still sensual. I would argue still is rooted in this transcending of the senses.
All right. Any final comments on any of that from?
Yeah, just theologically speaking, I mean, I really think that we need to, this is just my opinion, I think there's a lot of general talk about the sublime and transcendence and these things in theology and arts world, and the particular action of a triune God often gets lost. And so I view whatever beauty is the revelation of the love of God revealed in Jesus by the Spirit. And that kind of changes, how we view beauty, because God always meets us where we are, but never leaves us there. And so there is a generosity to God's beauty, but then there's an uncontrollability to it, that we're always going to be, it's like C.S. Lewis's imagery. Like, we thought God was going to enter our lives and kind of tinker around a little bit, refresh, and he's blowing out walls and he's putting up turrets, like that's the kind of transformation beauty brings.